The alarms on the science station Halcyon Ring screamed through every corridor at once. Counselor Vesa Ayin gripped the edge of a control panel as the floor shook beneath her feet. Outside the viewport, 3 enemy warships tore through the defense line like paper. The defenders called them the Ashen Fleet, a force that had already erased 2 neighboring systems from the star charts. Nobody knew where they came from. Nobody knew what they wanted. All anyone knew was that nothing built by the coalition of free worlds had ever stopped them. Vesa steadied herself against a railing and looked at the tactical display. Red markers spread across the screen faster than the operators could update them. Ships were falling. Stations were going dark. The coalition, a union of 11 species that had spent 2 centuries building peace among the stars, was being erased one outpost at a time. "Status on the outer shield," she called out. A young technician named Dren Ostel, a lean insectoid with quick, nervous hands, answered without looking up from his console. "Shield integrity at 30%. It will not hold another hour." Vesa closed her eyes for a moment. She had spent her whole career believing that diplomacy could solve anything. Today, that belief was being tested in the worst possible way. The chamber doors slid open, and General Torin Vale entered, his 4 eyes scanning the room in quick succession. He was a Kesathi commander, broad-shouldered and battle-worn, the kind of leader who had led fleets through a dozen conflicts and never lost his composure. Today his composure was cracking. "The southern colonies are gone," he said. "Ashen ships do not take prisoners. They do not negotiate. They simply erase." "Then we need another option," Vesa said. "We are out of ships. We are out of time." Torin's mandibles clicked together, a sound that in Kesathi culture meant deep frustration. "There is no other option. We have exhausted every ally. Every fleet in range has already fallen or fled." A quiet voice spoke from the back of the room. "There is one option left. We have simply been too afraid to use it." All eyes turned to a young coalition officer named Isla Marn, barely out of her training years, standing near the communications terminal. She was Velkari, a species known for caution and careful thought, not for bold declarations. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, but her voice did not waver. "The Deathworlders," she said. "Earth." The room went silent. Even the alarms seemed to fade into the background for a moment. General Torin's 4 eyes narrowed. "You are suggesting we call the humans." "I am suggesting we call the only species in this galaxy that has never once been defeated by anything," Isla said. "Not their planet, not disease, not war, not each other, no matter how hard they tried." "They are dangerous," Torin said. "Every report from every species that has studied them says the same thing. Their world is a nightmare of storms, predators, and disasters, and somehow they thrive in it. We do not understand them, and what we do not understand, we should not invite into our conflicts. They are also the only ones who might survive fighting the Ashen Fleet," Isla said. "Every other option has already failed." Vesa looked between the 2 of them. She thought of the burning colonies. She thought of the silence that followed each lost transmission. She had read the same files Torin had read, files that described Earth as a planet that should not support life, and yet did, in overwhelming abundance. Predators larger than starships in some oceans. Storms that could flatten cities. A history soaked in conflict, yes, but also a history of humans pulling each other from disasters no other species could imagine surviving. "They frighten us, because we do not understand how they are still alive," Vesa said quietly. "Maybe it is time we found out." Torin's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. The silence in the room was an answer of its own. Vesa turned to Isla. "Send the signal." Isla's hands moved quickly over the console, her nervousness giving way to focus. "The signal will take time to reach their system. Even at maximum relay speed, it could be hours before anyone on Earth receives it." "Then send it now," Vesa said. "We may not have hours to spare, but we have no other card left to play." Outside the station, the battle grew worse. A support cruiser flickered off the display, its signal gone in an instant. Somewhere in that ship had been 300 crew members, most of them younger than Isla. Vesa forced herself not to think about it. There would be time to grieve later, if there was a later. A second technician, an older Velkari named Soren Adek, hurried into the chamber carrying a data slate. His hands shook as he handed it to Vesa. Long-range scans confirm it. The Ashen ships are not simply attacking, they are consuming. Every planet they strike loses its atmosphere within days. Nothing regrows. Nothing returns. Vesa scanned the report, her stomach tightening with every line. How many systems remain in their path? At current speed, 17, Soren said, including this one. Torin slammed a heavy fist against the console, cracking the surface panel. Then we fight until our last ship falls. That has always been the Coalition way. The Coalition way has cost us 4 systems already, Vesa said, her voice sharp enough to cut through his anger. Courage without a plan is simply another word for surrender. The tension in the room was heavy enough to feel like a physical weight. Every officer present understood the same terrible truth. Their combined fleets, built from the greatest engineering minds of 11 civilizations, had done nothing to slow the Ashen advance. Weapons that could level mountains barely scratched their hulls. Shields that had protected worlds for centuries collapsed within minutes of contact. Isla stood near the terminal, watching the numbers climb on the casualty reports, feeling the full weight of what she had just done. She had broken protocol. She had reached out to a species that the Coalition Charter specifically listed as unaligned and unpredictable. If the Council later condemned her actions, she would accept the consequences. Right now, survival mattered more than procedure. There is something else you should know, she said quietly. The humans do not just survive their world. They have expanded their reach far beyond it. Independent explorers, scattered trade contacts, even a few of our own scholars who studied there quietly, all describe the same pattern. Humans face disaster, adapt within days, and return stronger than before. No other species we have encountered rebuilds like they do. Torin looked unconvinced, but he no longer argued. The evidence mounting before him left little room for pride. Vesa walked toward the viewport, watching the distant flashes of destroyed ships flicker like dying stars. We built our alliance on the idea that some species were too wild to include. We called them dangerous because we did not understand their strength. Perhaps today we pay the price for that mistake. Or perhaps today we correct it, Mila said. The console chimed softly, confirming the signal had cleared the outer relay and was now racing through open space toward a small, distant solar system most Coalition citizens had never even bothered to study. Isla typed the final command and pressed her palm to the activation panel. A soft chime confirmed the transmission had launched, carrying a simple message wrapped in every translation protocol the Coalition possessed. It was not a demand. It was not even a formal request. It was, in its rawest form, a plea. To the people of Earth. This is Ambassador Isla Marn, of the Coalition of Free Worlds. Our systems are under attack by a force we cannot stop. We do not know if you will answer. We do not know if you should trust us, given how our people have treated yours in the past. But we are asking, because we have nothing left to offer, except honesty. We need help. Please. The message shot outward into the dark, riding waves of light toward a small blue planet on the edge of Coalition space. A planet most species avoided, feared, and quietly mocked, calling its people too wild, too reckless, too dangerous to associate with. Back on the station, Torin stared at the display as more markers turned red. You understand what you have done, he said to Vesa. If they come, and if even half of what is written about them is true, we may be trading one danger for another. Maybe, Vesa said. But right now, dying quietly to an enemy we cannot even identify feels far more dangerous than gambling on the one species that has never lost a fight it was determined to win. Dren, still hunched over his console, spoke up in a smaller voice. Shield integrity down to 20%. Vesa straightened her shoulders and looked out at the burning edge of the battle. Somewhere beyond the smoke and static, a signal was racing across the stars, carrying the last hope of a dying alliance toward a world the galaxy had spent generations trying to forget. She did not know if anyone would answer. She did not know if the stories about Earth were exaggerated or true. All she knew was that for the first time in this long, losing war, she finally felt something other than despair. She felt a fragile, dangerous thread of hope. And far across the galaxy, deep within a quiet, unremarkable communications outpost hidden beneath the mountains of a small European valley, A console that had been silent for years suddenly lit up with an incoming transmission from beyond the edge of known space. A soft alert chimed through an empty room. Nobody was there to hear it yet, but somewhere in that valley, a woman named Grace Miller was about to receive a call that would change the course of 2 galaxies. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand beside her bed, an emergency alert code she had not seen used in 3 years. She sat up in the dark, heart pounding, already reaching for her boots before her mind had fully caught up with what was happening. Whatever this was, it was big, and it was calling her by name. Grace Miller pulled her boots on before her mind had even finished waking up. The emergency code on her phone was one she had not seen flash since the founding of her unit, a small, unofficial group known only to a handful of governments as the Response Division. It was not part of any army. It was not listed in any budget. It existed for one reason only: to handle situations too strange, too dangerous, or too impossible for anyone else to manage. She grabbed her jacket and stepped out into the cold night air of the valley. A car was already waiting outside her cabin, engine running, headlights cutting through the mist that clung to the mountains. The driver, a quiet young man named Oliver Bennett, nodded at her as she climbed in. "They would not tell me anything," Oliver said, pulling onto the narrow mountain road, "just that it came from Central Command, and that every senior member is being called in tonight." "That is never good," Grace muttered, checking her phone for updates that were not there. They drove in silence for the next 20 minutes, the headlights carving a path through dense trees, until the road curved toward a hidden checkpoint, disguised as an old mining facility. Guards waved them through without a word once they recognized the vehicle. Grace had worked with the Response Division for nearly 9 years, long enough to know that whatever waited for her inside was not a drill. The underground facility hummed with quiet activity as she stepped out of the elevator. Screens lined the walls of the main command room, most of them still dark, waiting for information that had not yet arrived. A dozen familiar faces were already gathered around the central table, some in uniform, some clearly pulled straight from their beds like she had been. At the head of the table stood Director Nathan Price, a calm, steady man in his 50s who had led the division since its earliest days. Beside him stood Laura Bennett, the division's lead scientist, her tablet glowing as she scrolled through incoming data. "Good, everyone is here," Nathan said as Grace took her seat. "About 40 minutes ago, our deep space listening array picked up an incoming transmission unlike anything we have on record." He tapped a control, and the main screen flickered to life, displaying a strange, layered signal pattern unlike any human broadcast format. "It is not military. It is not a probe malfunction. It is a deliberate, structured message," Laura explained. "Our systems ran it through every translation model we have, and it actually worked. Someone out there wanted us to understand it." "Understand what?" asked a broad-shouldered man near the back of the room, an engineer named Ryan Cole who had joined the division 5 years earlier after a career studying extreme environments. Nathan pressed another control, and a synthesized voice began playing the translated message through the room's speakers. It was Isla's plea, stripped of static and rebuilt into clear, simple words. The room fell completely silent as the message played from start to finish. When it ended, nobody spoke for several seconds. "They are asking for help," said a young analyst named Ellie Woods, disbelief clear in her voice. "An actual alien civilization is asking humanity for help." "It could be a trap," Ryan said immediately. "We have no way of confirming who sent this, why they sent it, or what they actually want from us." "It could also be exactly what it sounds like," Laura said. "A group of desperate people, watching their homes get destroyed, reaching out because they are out of options." Grace leaned forward, studying the star coordinates included in the transmission. "How far is this system from us?" "Roughly 140 light-years," Laura said. "But whatever technology they used to send this message arrived far faster than anything we understand. If they have propulsion systems that match their communication speed, this is not a small operation. This is a civilization with resources we cannot fully comprehend." Nathan folded his arms, studying the faces around the table. "There is something else you all need to hear. This transmission specifically mentions us, not humanity in general terms, but Earth by name, with historical context about how other species view us." He tapped the screen again, and a secondary file opened, displaying fragments of intercepted coalition records that had somehow been attached to the transmission, perhaps intentionally, perhaps as an act of good faith. The records used a term that made several people in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. Deathworlders. They call us that because our planet is considered nearly impossible to survive by galactic standards, Laura explained. Extreme storms, dangerous wildlife, unstable geography in places, and yet here we are, billions of us, living through it every single day. Apparently that terrifies most of the species out there. So they are calling us monsters, Ryan said flatly. They are calling us survivors, Grace corrected. There is a difference. An uneasy murmur spread through the room. Grace understood the reaction. Humanity had a long, complicated history of being underestimated, avoided, or treated with suspicion by outsiders who never bothered to look past the surface. It stung to learn that this pattern apparently extended far beyond their own planet. Even if the fear is unfair, Nathan said, the question in front of us right now is simple. Do we respond? The room erupted into overlapping voices. Ryan argued that engaging with an unknown alien conflict was reckless and could expose Earth to threats it was not prepared for. Ellie countered that ignoring a genuine plea for help, especially one framed with such desperation, was not the kind of legacy humanity should choose. Laura pointed out the potential scientific value of contact, while another officer worried about triggering a wider galactic response that could target Earth directly. Grace listened to all of it without speaking, her eyes fixed on the star map still glowing on the screen. She thought about every disaster response she had ever led, every flood, every earthquake, every crisis that seemed impossible to survive, until someone simply refused to give up. She thought about how often people underestimated her team, right up until the moment they proved otherwise. They said in the message that they do not know if we will trust them, given how their people have treated ours in the past, Grace said finally, her voice cutting through the noise. That tells me they already expect us to say no. They are not demanding anything from us. They are asking, knowing we have every reason to refuse. The room quieted slightly. That does not make it safe, Ryan said. No, Grace agreed. But it makes it honest. And in my experience, the people who ask for help while expecting rejection are usually the ones who need it most. Nathan studied her for a long moment before turning to the rest of the table. This is not a decision I intend to make alone. Everyone here has earned a voice in it. But I want to be clear about something first. If we respond, we are stepping into a conflict none of us understand, against an enemy capable of erasing entire star systems. We do not know their weapons. We do not know their strategy. We would be walking in blind. We have walked into worse, with less information, Ryan admitted quietly, some of his earlier resistance fading. That is sort of our specialty. Laura smiled faintly despite the tension in the room. It is very on brand for us. Grace stood, walking closer to the star map, studying the distant marker representing the coalition's dying territory. I have spent my whole career being told the situation was impossible, before I even had a chance to try. I am done letting other people decide what humans are capable of, especially when the alternative is watching an entire alliance disappear while we sit safely at home. Nathan exhaled slowly, glancing around the table one final time. Every face reflected the same mixture of fear and determination. Nobody in that room had built a career avoiding difficult choices. All right, he said. We respond. But we do this the way we do everything, carefully, and together. I want a full briefing on coalition species, their technology, and anything Laura's team can pull from those intercepted records before we send anyone through that signal corridor. There is a complication, Laura said, scrolling through her tablet. This transmission included coordinates for a return relay point, but the corridor itself is unstable. Whoever built that communication path clearly did not expect to use it for actual travel. If we send a ship through, we would be improvising most of the journey. When has that ever stopped us? Oliver said from near the doorway, earning a few tired laughs that helped ease the tension in the room. Nathan nodded slowly. Assemble the response team. I want volunteers only, no exceptions. Whoever steps forward for this needs to understand exactly what they are walking into. Within the hour, nearly every senior member of the division had volunteered. a decision that surprised no one who had worked alongside them before. Grace watched as Laura began preparing technical data, as Ryan pulled up structural blueprints for their fastest available transport vessel, and as Ellie coordinated with international liaisons to keep the mission quiet until more was known. Grace found herself standing near the observation window overlooking the facility's lower deck, watching engineers begin preparations on a compact exploration vessel named Horizon Crest, the only ship in their fleet capable of attempting a journey through an unstable corridor of unknown alien origin. It was not built for interstellar combat. It was built for survival, for adaptability, for exactly the kind of unpredictable, dangerous conditions humanity had somehow learned to live through for thousands of years. Nathan approached and stood beside her, his hands clasped behind his back. "You know, this could go very badly." "I know," Grace said. "You know we might be walking straight into a war we do not fully understand, against an enemy nobody has ever managed to stop. I know that too." Nathan allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Then I suppose there is nothing left to say except good luck." Grace looked out at the ship being prepared below, at the small crew already gathering their equipment with quiet determination, despite the fear clearly written across some of their faces. She thought of the desperate plea that had reached them from across the galaxy, of an alliance of frightened species watching their worlds burn, hoping against hope that the very people they once called too dangerous to trust might be the ones brave enough to save them. "They called us Deathworlders, like it was meant to be a warning," Grace said quietly. "I think it is about to become the reason they survive." In the hours before launch, the crew moved through final preparations with the practiced calm of people who had trained for chaos their entire careers. Laura ran diagnostics on the translation equipment they had built from the intercepted coalition data, testing it again and again to make sure it would not fail them the moment it mattered most. Ryan inspected every seal and support beam on the Horizon Crest personally, unwilling to trust the ship's survival to anyone else's checklist. Ellie worked with quiet focus, cataloging everything known about the enemy fleet from the fragments included in the transmission, searching for any pattern that might offer an advantage once they arrived. Grace spent part of that time speaking privately with each member of the response team, making sure every single person understood they could still step back without judgment. Nobody did. She was not surprised. The response division had never attracted people who ran from difficult choices, and this was simply the largest and strangest choice any of them had ever faced. Near the end of their preparations, Oliver found her checking supply crates near the loading bay and leaned against the wall beside her. "Do you really think we can make a difference out there? An entire alliance of species with technology centuries ahead of ours is losing this fight. What makes anyone think a handful of humans on one ship changes that?" Grace considered the question carefully before answering. "I do not think we win because our weapons are better or our ships are faster. I think we win because nobody out there has ever seen a species refuse to quit the way we do." That message said, "They call us Deathworlders because they cannot understand how we survive impossible conditions every single day." Maybe that confusion is exactly the advantage we need. Oliver nodded slowly, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "That is either the most inspiring thing you have ever said, or the most reckless." "With this team," Grace said, allowing herself a small smile, "it is usually both." By the time the final systems check was complete, the entire crew stood gathered near the boarding ramp, equipment secured, uncertainty visible on more than a few faces, yet none of them hesitating. Nathan walked the length of the platform, shaking hands, offering quiet words of encouragement, treating this departure with the same seriousness he had given every mission the division had ever undertaken, and perhaps a little more. "Bring everyone home," he told Grace as she reached the ramp. "Always do." Within hours, the Horizon Crest stood fully prepared on its launch platform, its hull gleaming under floodlights as the response team boarded one by one. Grace paused at the entrance ramp, looking back at the mountains surrounding the facility, at the quiet, ordinary world she was about to leave behind. Then she stepped inside, the ramp closed behind her, and for the first time in recorded history, a ship built by human hands prepared to cross the stars, not out of conquest, not out of curiosity, but because somewhere out there, people were dying, and humanity had finally been asked to help. The engines roared to life beneath her feet as the ship rose into the night sky, leaving the safety of Earth's atmosphere behind, racing toward coordinates that led into a war nobody back home fully understood. Somewhere far ahead, across 140 light-years of empty space, Vesa Een stared at her monitors, watching the last of her defensive lines crumble, unaware that help was already on its way. The horizon crest shuddered violently as it dropped out of the unstable corridor, alarms blaring across the cockpit as every screen flickered with warnings. Grace gripped the edge of her console, bracing against the turbulence while Ryan fought to stabilize their systems. "Structural stress at 80%, Ryan called out, his hands moving rapidly across the controls. "We are not built for this kind of transit." "Just get us through," Grace said, watching the swirling distortion outside the viewport twist and stretch like liquid glass. With one final, bone-rattling jolt, the ship burst into open space, and the chaos of the corridor gave way to something far more alarming. Directly ahead, the battle Vesa had been fighting for hours filled the entire viewport. Dozens of damaged Coalition vessels scattered across the void, exchanging weapons fire with sleek, dark enemy ships that moved with unsettling precision. "That is a lot more firepower than the message suggested," Ellie said quietly from her station. Laura was already scanning the enemy vessels, her instruments struggling to process the readings. "Their hull composition does not match anything in our database. Whatever they are made of, it is absorbing most conventional energy signatures." Grace studied the battlefield for only a moment before making her decision. "Laura, get a channel open on whatever frequency their transmission used. Ryan, keep us moving. Do not give them an easy target." Aboard the Halcyon ring, Vesa's console lit up with an unfamiliar signal pattern. Dren nearly fell out of his seat scrambling to decode it. "Counselor, we have an incoming transmission," he said, disbelief thick in his voice. "It is them. It is actually them." Vesa moved quickly to the communications terminal, her heart's pounding in her chest. "Patch it through." Grace's voice filled the chamber, calm despite the chaos surrounding her ship. "This is Grace Miller, of the Response Division, representing Earth. We received your transmission. We are here to help, though I will be honest, we do not fully understand what we are walking into." Vesa felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for days. "Thank you for answering. I did not expect anyone would." "We almost did not," Grace admitted. "But we could not sit back and do nothing. Tell us what you need." Torin stepped forward, studying the small human vessel on the display with obvious skepticism. "One ship. You sent one ship to face a fleet that has already destroyed everything we have thrown at it." "One ship with a very stubborn crew," Grace replied. "Trust me, we have survived worse odds than this." Before anyone could respond, the enemy fleet shifted formation, 3 vessels breaking away from the main assault to intercept the newly arrived human ship. Vesa's stomach twisted with dread. She had summoned this fragile, unprepared crew into the heart of a battle they could not possibly survive. "Get out of there," she said urgently. "Those ships will not hesitate." "We noticed," Ryan muttered, already adjusting course. What happened next left every Coalition officer watching the display in stunned silence. Instead of retreating, the horizon crest dove directly toward the incoming enemy vessels, weaving through weapons fire with sharp, unpredictable movements that no standard evasive pattern could explain. Ryan piloted with a mixture of precision and controlled recklessness, using terrain data from Earth's most violent storm systems to inform maneuvers that defied every tactical model in the Coalition's records. "What is he doing?" Dren asked, watching the readouts in disbelief. "I have flown through hurricanes with less warning than this," Ryan said through the open channel, his voice tight with focus but strangely calm. "This is nothing." The human ship rolled sharply, narrowly avoiding a direct hit, then used the enemy vessel's own momentum against it, clipping past close enough to scan its hull structure in detail before pulling away. Laura's voice came through the channel next, quick and sharp. "I have a weak point. Their hull absorbs energy weapons, but it cannot handle rapid thermal shifts. If we can hit them with something that changes temperature fast enough, the material should crack." "We do not carry weapons designed for that," Torin said, confusion evident in his tone. "We were not planning to use weapons," Grace said. "Laura, Can you rig the coolant systems to vent directly at their hull on our next pass? Already on it, Laura said, already pulling apart a control panel with practiced efficiency. The horizon crest circled back toward the pursuing enemy ships, and on Ryan's signal, Laura released a concentrated burst of superheated coolant directly onto the hull of the nearest vessel. The temperature shock, insignificant to most coalition weaponry, struck the enemy hull like a hammer. Thin cracks spread rapidly across its surface, and within seconds, the ship's systems failed entirely, drifting powerless as its crew scrambled inside. On the Halcyon ring, the entire command chamber erupted into stunned murmurs. Vesa stared at the display, momentarily speechless. Torin's mandibles clicked rapidly, a mixture of shock and reluctant admiration. They disabled an ashen vessel with waste heat from their engines, he said slowly. They improvised, Isla said, awe clear in her voice. In the middle of active combat, with no preparation, they simply improvised. Grace's voice returned over the channel, breathless but steady. That will not work twice. They will adapt, but it should buy us some room to talk strategy. Vesa allowed herself the smallest flicker of hope since the battle had begun. Come aboard the Halcyon ring. We need a full briefing, and I suspect you need one as well. The Horizon Crest docked at the station's damaged but functional hangar bay, and Grace led her team down the ramp into a hallway filled with Coalition personnel who stared at them with open, unfiltered curiosity. Some watched with wide, fascinated eyes. Others kept a visible, cautious distance, whispering quietly among themselves in languages the human translators struggled to fully capture. A Velkari technician near the hangar entrance actually flinched backward as Ryan passed, prompting a nearby colleague to murmur something that included the word Deathworlder, spoken like a mixture of warning and fascination. Friendly bunch, Ryan muttered under his breath. They have spent generations hearing stories about us, Grace said quietly. Give them time. Vesa met them personally at the entrance to the command chamber, her expression a careful blend of gratitude and lingering uncertainty. Thank you for coming. I understand this is not what your species expected when you decided to answer our call. Not exactly, Grace admitted, but we adapt quickly. It is sort of our specialty. As the team entered the command chamber, Torin studied them with open scrutiny, his posture rigid and cautious. Your pilot flew directly into enemy fire without hesitation. Your scientist rigged an improvised weapon in the middle of combat using nothing but engine coolant. Is this normal behavior for your species? Pretty much, Ellie said with a small shrug. We do not really have the luxury of hesitation back home. Our planet does not wait around for us to feel ready. Laura stepped forward, already pulling data from her tablet to compare with the Coalition's own combat records. If you can share detailed scans of the enemy hull composition, I can start working on a longer-term solution. Whatever material they are using, it clearly was not designed with rapid environmental shifts in mind. Vesa nodded, gesturing toward a nearby console. Everything we have is yours. Over the next several hours, the human team worked alongside Coalition scientists and officers, and the initial unease in the room gradually began to shift. Dren, still visibly nervous around Ryan at first, eventually found himself fascinated by the human's ability to remain calm under pressure, asking careful, curious questions about how anyone learned to fly with such controlled recklessness. You get used to unpredictable conditions when your entire planet throws storms, floods, and worse at you on a regular basis, Ryan explained, adjusting a data cable with practiced ease. You either learn to adapt fast, or you do not last very long. Your planet sounds terrifying, Dren said honestly. It is also home, Ryan replied simply. You learn to love the thing that keeps trying to kill you. Eventually, it just becomes normal. Isla, watching quietly from nearby, found herself drawn into conversation with Grace, curiosity overcoming her earlier caution. The records call your species erratic and difficult to predict. Watching you work, I do not see erratic. I see something closer to controlled instinct. That is a fair way to put it, Grace said. We are used to situations changing faster than any plan can account for. So we learn to think on our feet, instead of relying entirely on plans that might not survive contact with reality. That would explain why our tactical models failed so completely against you today, Isla admitted. You did not follow any predictable strategy. You simply reacted, and somehow it worked. Vesa called a wider strategy session in the main briefing hall, inviting representatives from several coalition species to observe the newly formed partnership firsthand. The room filled quickly. Curious officers and scientists from species Grace had never encountered before, each reacting to the presence of humans in their own distinct way. A tall, silver-skinned Korvath diplomat kept a respectful but noticeable distance, occasionally exchanging quiet glances with colleagues. A pair of small, quick-moving Threll engineers approached almost immediately, peppering Laura with rapid questions about human technology. Is it true your species builds machines that fail constantly, yet you continue using them anyway? One of the Threll engineers asked, her voice buzzing with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. More or less, Laura said, laughing softly. We do not always wait for perfect solutions. Sometimes we just need something that works well enough to get the job done, and we improve it later. That explains a great deal, the engineer replied, scribbling notes onto a small handheld device. Grace watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. The tension that had greeted them in the hangar bay was slowly giving way to something closer to fascination. It was not full trust, not yet, but it was progress, and progress was more than she had expected this quickly. Vesa stepped to the front of the room, activating a large holographic display showing the full scope of the Ashen Fleet's advance across Coalition territory. Before we continue, everyone here needs a clear picture of what we are facing. This is not a single battle. This is an extermination campaign that has already claimed 4 systems and shows no sign of slowing. The display shifted, showing a timeline of destroyed worlds, each marked with a small, somber symbol representing lives lost. Grace felt her chest tighten as the numbers scrolled past, a grim reminder of exactly how high the stakes truly were. Our weapons cannot penetrate their hulls, Torin said, addressing the room. Our shields collapse within minutes of sustained contact. Everything we have built over centuries of conflict has proven insufficient. Until today, Isla added, gesturing toward the human team. Their improvised tactic disabled an Ashen vessel in a way none of our simulations predicted. Laura stepped forward, pulling up detailed scans on the shared display. The thermal shock method worked because their hull material prioritizes energy absorption over structural flexibility. It is an incredibly strong defense against weapons fire, but it creates a vulnerability against sudden environmental extremes. If we can develop a reliable way to deliver that kind of shock at scale, we may be able to disable multiple vessels at once, rather than relying on lucky improvisation. That would require significant modifications to our existing fleet, Torin said, though his earlier skepticism had noticeably softened. Modifications we do not currently have the resources or time to complete. Then we build something smaller and faster instead, Ryan said, stepping up beside Laura. Deployable canisters instead of full ship systems. Something we can launch from multiple vessels at once, hitting several targets before they even realize what is happening. A murmur of interest spread through the room. Soren, still visibly impressed by his earlier conversation with Laura, leaned forward with genuine enthusiasm. We have canister delivery systems already installed on most of our smaller vessels for emergency supply drops. Repurposing them would not take long. Then let us get started, Grace said. The longer we wait, the more time the Ashen Fleet has to adapt to what we just showed them. The room shifted into focused motion, engineers and scientists from multiple species gathering around shared displays, exchanging ideas across language barriers, with the help of translation devices humming quietly at their sides. Grace moved through the room, watching as walls that had existed for generations, walls built from fear, misunderstanding, and old prejudice, slowly began to crack under the shared urgency of survival. Near the edge of the room, Dren approached Ellie hesitantly, still clearly nervous, but visibly curious despite himself. Earlier, in the hangar, I reacted poorly when your pilot walked past. I apologize. The stories about your species painted a very different picture than what I am seeing now. Ellie offered a warm, understanding smile. It is okay. We have heard worse back home, honestly. People fear what they do not understand. The important part is what happens after that fear, whether you let it stop you from learning something new, or whether you push past it. Dren considered this for a moment before nodding slowly. Then I would like to learn, if you are willing to teach. Absolutely, Ellie said, already pulling up a display to walk him through the diagnostic work she had been doing earlier. As the hours passed, small moments of connection began to form throughout the station. A group of Coalition engineers watched in amazement as Ellie repaired a damaged relay system using a combination of human tools and salvaged Coalition parts, solving in 20 minutes a problem their own technicians had struggled with for days. Laura and a Coalition scientist named Soren fell into an animated discussion about thermal shock resistance that stretched well beyond its original purpose, both clearly enjoying the exchange of ideas. Even Torin, still guarded, found himself unable to deny the shift happening around him. He approached Grace near the observation deck as the human team paused for a brief rest, his 4 eyes studying her carefully. "I have led fleets for over 30 years, he said. "I have never seen anything like what your crew did today." "We are not trying to prove anything," Grace said honestly. "We just do not know how to give up. It has gotten us into plenty of trouble over the years, but it has also gotten us through things that should have ended us 100 times over." Torin considered this for a long moment. "Perhaps the galaxy misunderstood your species for the wrong reasons. We called you dangerous because your world nearly kills you every day. Perhaps we should have called you remarkable instead, for surviving it anyway." Grace allowed herself a small, tired smile. "We will take either one, as long as it comes with your cooperation. Because from what I have seen so far, the fight ahead of us is only just beginning." Outside the viewport, the Ashen fleet regrouped in the distance, their formation shifting with cold, calculated precision, preparing for a renewed assault that would test everything the newly formed alliance had just begun to build. Alarms tore through the Halcyon ring as the Ashen fleet surged forward, their formation splitting into 3 coordinated waves, aimed directly at the station's remaining defenses. Vessa's hands tightened around the edge of her console as the tactical display filled with incoming markers. "They are moving faster than before," Torin said, his voice tense. "They have adapted to our earlier tactic." "Then it is a good thing we are not relying on the same tactic twice," Grace said, already moving toward the coordination terminal, where Laura and Ryan had spent the last several hours finalizing their modified canister systems. "All vessels equipped with the thermal shock canisters, report status," Laura called out over the shared communication channel. One by one, ship commanders from across the Coalition fleet responded, confirming readiness. It was a smaller fleet than the one that had faced the Ashen ships hours earlier, battered and reduced by days of relentless conflict, but for the first time since the war began, there was something different in their voices. Not certainty, not yet, but determination sharpened by a plan that finally offered a real chance. "Launch coordinates are set," Ryan said, seated at the Horizon Crest's controls once again, the small human ship positioned at the front of the formation, alongside Torin's flagship. "On your signal, Counselor." Vessa took a steadying breath, watching the enemy formation close the distance with terrifying speed. "All ships, engage." The combined fleet surged forward, breaking from their previous defensive posture into an aggressive, coordinated advance. Ashen vessels opened fire immediately, their weapons carving bright streaks across the battlefield, but the Coalition ships moved with unfamiliar unpredictability now, weaving through attack patterns influenced by the same unconventional tactics Ryan had demonstrated earlier. "First wave canisters deploy," Laura called out. Dozens of small, fast-moving canisters launched from Coalition vessels across the formation, each one designed to release a concentrated burst of thermal shock directly against enemy hulls. The effect was immediate and devastating. Ashen ships that had shrugged off years of conventional weapons fire began to crack under the sudden temperature extremes, their advanced defensive systems utterly unprepared for an attack method they had never encountered before. "It is working," Dren said from his station aboard the Halcyon ring, watching the tactical display with growing disbelief. Multiple enemy vessels reporting critical hull failures. The Ashen fleet, faced with an unfamiliar and unpredictable threat, began to shift its strategy, but the change came too late. Their formations, built around absorbing conventional weapons fire, left them vulnerable to Coalition ships, now moving with newfound aggression and confidence. Grace watched from the command chamber as the tide of the battle, for the first time in this long, exhausting war, began to turn. Yet the victory was not without cost. A coalition cruiser near the edge of the formation took a direct hit, its hull rupturing as emergency signals flooded the communication channel. Vessa's face tightened with grief she did not have time to fully process. "We are losing the Kalen," Torin reported grimly. "Casualties confirmed." Grace felt the weight of that loss settle over the room, a stark reminder that even a winning strategy came with painful sacrifice. She thought of every disaster response she had ever led, every mission where success and loss existed side by side, and she pushed forward anyway, because stopping now would only cost more lives. "Second wave, keep pressing their flank," she said. "We cannot let up now." Aboard the Horizon Crest, the mood was far tenser than the confident reports reaching the command chamber suggested. Ryan banked the small ship hard to the left, narrowly avoiding a burst of enemy fire that scorched past close enough to rattle the hull. "We are drawing a lot of attention," he said through gritted teeth, hands steady despite the strain in his voice. "3 Ashen ships have broken off to focus on us specifically." "They noticed we are the ones causing the most damage," Laura said, bracing herself against her console as another impact shook the ship. "Reroute power from non-essential systems. I need everything we have for the next canister launch." Ellie, monitoring communications from her station, cut in urgently. "Grace, the Horizon Crest is taking concentrated fire. They need support." In the command chamber, Grace's jaw tightened as she studied the display, watching 3 enemy markers converge on the small human vessel, weaving desperately through open space. "Torin, can you redirect any nearby ships to cover them?" "The nearest support is engaged elsewhere," Torin said, frustration clear in his voice. "It would take several minutes to reach them." "They do not have several minutes," Vessa said grimly. Aboard the Horizon Crest, another impact rocked the ship violently, sparks bursting from a damaged panel near the rear compartment. Oliver, strapped into the secondary controls, worked quickly to reroute power away from the failing system before it could spread further. "Hull integrity at 60%, Oliver reported, his voice tight but controlled. "We cannot take many more hits like that." "Then we stop taking hits," Ryan said, pulling the ship into a sharp, spiraling dive that used the drifting wreckage of a destroyed vessel as cover. Debris scattered around them as enemy fire tore through the space they had occupied only seconds earlier. "I need 30 more seconds to finish charging the next canister payload," Laura said, sweat beading on her forehead as she worked frantically at her console. "You have got 15, Ryan replied, weaving through another burst of incoming fire, the ship groaning under the strain of the constant maneuvers. Grace watched the exchange unfold on the tactical display, every instinct urging her to find some way to help, knowing there was little she could do from the command chamber, except trust her team. She had sent people into dangerous situations more times than she could count over the years, but this felt different, heavier, with an entire alliance of species watching to see whether humanity's reputation was truly earned or simply exaggerated legend. "Come on," she murmured under her breath, watching the 3 enemy markers close in around the small, weaving human vessel. Aboard the Horizon Crest, Laura's console finally chimed with confirmation. "Payload ready." "Everyone hold on," Ryan said, pulling the ship into a tight reversal that put them directly between the pursuing Ashen vessels, close enough that their weapons risked hitting each other if they fired carelessly. "Launching now," Laura said, releasing 3 canisters simultaneously, each one arcing toward a different enemy vessel. The thermal shock struck all 3 ships within seconds of each other. 2 Ashen vessels immediately lost power, their systems overwhelmed by the sudden temperature extremes. The third, though damaged, remained active, firing a final desperate volley as it struggled to regain control. "Brace," Ryan shouted, throwing the ship into a final, desperate maneuver. The impact clipped the edge of the Horizon Crest's hull, sending the ship spinning violently before Ryan managed to stabilize it, alarms blaring throughout the cabin. For a tense moment, nothing but static filled the communication channel. "Horizon Crest, report your status," Grace said urgently, her voice tight with concern. A pause stretched long enough to make her chest tighten painfully, before Ryan's voice finally came through, breathless, but alive. "We are still here, barely. Hull integrity is critical, but we are still here." Relief washed through the command chamber, though it was quickly tempered by the ongoing battle still raging around them. Vesa placed a steadying hand briefly on Grace's shoulder, a small, unspoken gesture of shared understanding between two leaders who knew all too well the weight of sending people into danger. They held the line, Vesa said quietly. Whatever else happens today, remember that. Grace nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the display, watching as the damaged horizon crest limped toward the relative safety of the Halcyon Ring's defensive perimeter, its earlier success against 3 enemy vessels rippling outward as other coalition ships adopted similar tactics across the battlefield. The battle raged on for what felt like hours, though in truth it lasted only a fraction of that time. Ashen vessels, one by one, began retreating from the fight, their formations breaking apart under the sustained, coordinated pressure of a fleet that had finally found a way to fight back effectively. Ryan guided the horizon crest through the chaos with practiced precision, delivering canisters to 2 more enemy vessels before pulling back to support Torin's flagship during a particularly dangerous exchange. "Enemy formation is breaking," Isla reported, disbelief and relief mixing in her voice. "They are retreating." A tense silence fell over the command chamber as everyone watched the Ashen fleet withdraw from the battlefield, their remaining vessels regrouping at a distance, before vanishing into a hurried retreat through an unstable corridor, similar to the one the horizon crest had used earlier. For a long moment, nobody spoke. "They are gone," Dren finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They are actually gone." Cheers erupted throughout the station, officers and technicians embracing one another, relief flooding through the corridors after days of relentless fear and loss. Vesa allowed herself a rare, exhausted smile, though the weight of everything lost during the siege remained heavy in her chest. Grace exhaled slowly, watching the retreating enemy signatures fade from the tactical display. She turned to find Torin approaching, his earlier skepticism completely replaced by something closer to genuine respect. "You did not just help us survive today," he said. "You changed the way we understand what is possible." "We had good teachers on both sides," Grace said, glancing toward Laura and Soren, still standing near their shared console, quietly reviewing data from the battle, with matching expressions of exhausted satisfaction. Vesa approached next, her 4 eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude and lingering sorrow for those lost during the fighting. "We will need time to properly honor those we lost today. But because of your help, far fewer names will be added to that list than would have been otherwise." "This is not over," Torin added, his tone growing serious again. "The Ashen fleet retreated, but they will return, likely with modifications to counter the tactic that just defeated them. This victory bought us time. It did not end the war." Grace nodded, understanding the weight of that truth all too well. "Then we use that time wisely. Because if there is one thing my species is good at, it is preparing for the next disaster before it arrives." Outside the viewport, the debris of battle drifted quietly among the stars, a somber reminder of the cost paid for this fragile victory. Yet beneath the exhaustion and grief, something new had taken root among the survivors, a cautious, hard-won trust between species who, only days earlier, had regarded each other with suspicion and fear. As the coalition fleet began the slow process of recovery, repairing damaged ships and tending to the wounded, Grace found herself standing beside Vesa near the station's main viewport, watching the stars in comfortable silence. "For generations, we called your species dangerous," Vesa said quietly. "Today, you proved us right, in a way none of us expected. You are dangerous, to anyone foolish enough to threaten the people you have chosen to protect." Grace allowed a tired, genuine smile. "We have heard that before. We are starting to think it might be true." 3 days after the battle above the Halcyon Ring, the station buzzed with a very different kind of energy than the desperate chaos that had filled its corridors before. Repair crews worked steadily throughout the damaged sections, patching hulls and restoring power grids, while survivors from destroyed colonies began arriving in search of shelter, information, and, for many, their first real glimpse of the species that had helped turn the tide of an unwinnable war. Grace stood near the main observation deck, watching a group of young Velkari children press their small hands against the viewport glass, staring in open fascination at the horizon crest as engineers worked to repair its damaged hull. One of them, braver than the rest, turned and waved enthusiastically when she noticed Grace watching. Grace waved back, smiling despite the exhaustion still lingering in her limbs. "They have been doing that all morning," Isla said, approaching quietly from behind. "The stories about your species painted such a frightening picture. It is strange, watching children who once feared the very idea of humans now looking at you with nothing but wonder. Fear tends to fade once people actually get the chance to look past the stories," Grace said. "It just takes someone willing to show up first." Isla nodded thoughtfully. "The Coalition Council has requested a formal meeting. Word of what happened here has already spread across our networks. Every member species wants to understand exactly what took place, and many are asking difficult questions about why we ever avoided contact with Earth in the first place." "That sounds like a conversation worth having," Grace said. The formal council session took place later that day, in the station's largest remaining chamber, hastily repaired for the occasion. Representatives from all 11 coalition species gathered, some attending in person, others joining through holographic projection from their home systems, still recovering from the devastation of recent weeks. Grace stood alongside her team near the center of the room, acutely aware of the weight of the moment. Vesa opened the session, her voice carrying clearly across the chamber. 3 days ago, this alliance stood on the edge of complete collapse. The Ashen Fleet had destroyed 4 systems, and every conventional strategy available to us had failed. In our most desperate hour, we reached out to a species our own records warned us to avoid, a species we labeled dangerous without ever truly understanding why. She gestured toward Grace and the rest of the human team. That decision saved this station, and quite possibly this entire alliance. A representative from the Korvath delegation, the same silver-skinned diplomat who had kept his distance in the earlier briefing, rose to speak, his tone measured, but noticeably less guarded than before. "I will admit, our historical caution regarding Earth was not without reason. Reports describe your species as unpredictable, prone to conflict, difficult to categorize by any consistent standard. Watching your team in action, I understand now that these traits, which we once viewed purely as dangerous, may simply be the natural result of surviving a world that demands constant adaptation. We are not going to pretend our history is simple or perfect," Grace said honestly, addressing the room. "Humanity has made plenty of mistakes, and we still have plenty of flaws. But when people needed help, we chose to answer, because that is who we want to be, even if the galaxy spent generations assuming otherwise." Torin, seated near the front of the chamber, rose next, his earlier skepticism now entirely replaced by open respect. "I fought beside their pilot in the heart of that battle. I watched their scientist develop a working countermeasure in the middle of active combat, using nothing but improvised equipment. Whatever reputation the galaxy previously assigned to Earth, I believe it requires serious reconsideration." Murmurs of agreement spread through the chamber, though a few representatives remained visibly cautious, unwilling to abandon generations of ingrained wariness so quickly. Grace understood their hesitation. Trust built in a single desperate battle could not undo an entire history of misunderstanding overnight, and she did not expect it to. "We are not asking anyone to forget their concerns," Grace said, addressing the more hesitant representatives directly. "Trust is not something that gets built through one battle. It gets built through consistency, through showing up again and again, through proving over time that the fear was misplaced. We are willing to put in that time, if the Coalition is willing to give us the chance." Vesa stepped forward, addressing the full council. "I propose a formal partnership between Earth and the Coalition of Free Worlds, beginning with continued cooperation against the Ashen threat, and expanding from there as trust develops naturally between our peoples." The proposal sparked extended discussion throughout the chamber, delegates debating logistics, concerns, and hopes for what such a partnership might mean for the future. Grace listened carefully, recognizing the same mixture of caution and cautious optimism she had seen in her own division back home when this mission had first been proposed. Change rarely came easily, even when it was desperately needed. By the end of the session, the council reached a decision, one built not on blind trust, but on the undeniable evidence of what had already been accomplished together. Earth would become a recognized ally of the Coalition of Free Worlds, its people no longer dismissed as an unpredictable danger to be avoided, but acknowledged as capable, resourceful partners in the fight against a threat that endangered every species involved. In the days that followed, the Horizon Crest completed its repairs, strengthened further with coalition technology shared freely as a gesture of goodwill. Laura spent hours exchanging research with Soren and the Threll engineers, developing improved versions of the thermal shock countermeasure that would soon be distributed across coalition shipyards. Ellie worked closely with Dren, teaching him diagnostic techniques that left him newly confident in his own abilities, while he in turn introduced her to coalition navigation systems that expanded her understanding of interstellar travel far beyond anything she had studied before. Grace found herself standing once again near the observation deck on their final evening before departure, watching the stars stretch endlessly beyond the station. Vesa joined her quietly, both women content to simply share the silence for a while before speaking. "The Ashen Fleet will return," Vesa said eventually, "stronger and better prepared for the tactics that defeated them this time." "We figured as much," Grace said. "But now you are not facing that fight alone, and neither are we. That changes things more than any weapon ever could." Vesa turned to look at her directly. "Why did your people really answer our call? I have read the transmission logs. Your own records describe hesitation, fear, uncertainty. Yet you came anyway." Grace considered the question carefully before answering. "Because somewhere out there, people were dying, and we had the ability to help. That is really the only reason that ever mattered. Everything else, the history, the fear, the old stories about what our species is supposed to be, none of that changes what was right in front of us." Vesa nodded slowly, something like quiet respect settling across her features. "Then perhaps the old stories about your species were simply incomplete. Deathworlders, survivors of impossible conditions, dangerous to anyone foolish enough to threaten what you protect. Perhaps that reputation, properly understood, is not something to fear at all." "Maybe not," Grace said, watching the distant stars twinkle against the endless dark. "Maybe it is exactly what the galaxy needed all along." Before their departure, Grace received an unexpected visit from a small delegation representing several of the survivor colonies that had taken refuge aboard the station. Among them stood a young Korvath woman named Selen, who had lost her entire settlement to the Ashen Advance only days before the human team arrived. She approached Grace with careful, deliberate steps, clearly uncertain how to begin. "I wanted to thank you," Selen said quietly. "Not just for the battle, though I understand how much that mattered. I wanted to thank you because when everything I knew was gone, your people gave the rest of us a reason to believe tomorrow was still possible." Grace felt the weight of those words settle deeply in her chest. She had spent years responding to disasters back on Earth, pulling survivors from wreckage, offering comfort in the aftermath of storms and disasters that left entire communities shattered. She recognized the particular kind of exhaustion and grief written across Selen's face, the same look she had seen countless times before, regardless of species or world of origin. "You do not need to thank us," Grace said gently. "Anyone would have done the same, given the chance." "That is exactly it," Selen said. "Not everyone would have. Many species heard about our situation and chose to look away, citing distance, risk, or simple indifference. Your people chose to come anyway, despite every reason not to. That difference matters more than you seem to realize." Grace found herself without an easy response, so she simply offered a warm, understanding smile and a gentle squeeze of Selen's hand, a small human gesture that seemed to translate universally across the gathered survivors. Later that evening, as final preparations for departure continued, Nathan reached out through the newly established communication relay, requesting a private briefing with Grace before the Horizon Crest began its journey home. His expression, projected across the small holographic display, carried a mixture of pride and quiet concern. "The story of what happened out there has already reached certain government channels back home," he said. "People are asking questions. Some are excited about the possibility of contact with other civilizations. Others are frightened, worried about what this means for Earth's safety and independence moving forward." "That sounds about right," Grace said. "It is a big adjustment for anyone to process quickly." "There will be resistance," Nathan warned. "Not everyone will welcome this partnership with open arms. You should prepare yourself for that reality once you return." Grace considered his words carefully, thinking of everything she had witnessed over the past several days, the fear and mistrust slowly giving way to genuine cooperation and respect between species, who had once viewed each other through the distorted lens of rumor and assumption. People feared us out here for the same reasons some will fear this partnership back home: misunderstanding, uncertainty, the discomfort of facing something unfamiliar. The only way through that fear is the same method that worked here: showing up, proving our intentions through action rather than argument, and giving people the time they need to see the truth for themselves. Nathan allowed a small, proud smile, spoken like someone who has spent her entire career doing exactly that. It is the only method I have ever really trusted, Grace admitted. As their conversation ended, Grace made her way toward the hangar bay, finding her team already gathered near the horizon crest, exchanging quiet farewells with the coalition officers and scientists who had become unexpected friends over the course of an extraordinary week. Laura shared a final, warm exchange with Soren, both promising to continue their collaborative research even across the vast distance separating their worlds. Ellie exchanged a genuine, heartfelt goodbye with Dren, who had grown remarkably more confident since their first nervous interaction days earlier. "You are welcome back any time," Dren said. "Preferably outside of a battle if possible." Ellie laughed. "I will do my best, though I cannot make any promises. Trouble tends to follow us." Ryan completed his final inspection of the Horizon Crest's repaired hull, running a steady hand along the reinforced plating that Coalition engineers had helped install. "She held together better than I expected, considering everything we put her through." "She had good pilots keeping her in one piece," Oliver said, clapping him lightly on the shoulder. Grace boarded the ship last, pausing briefly at the entrance to look back one final time at the station that had, only a week earlier, seemed like the site of an unavoidable tragedy. Now it stood as the birthplace of an alliance nobody could have predicted, built not through calculated strategy, but through the simple, stubborn refusal to abandon people who needed help. The following morning, the Horizon Crest departed the Halcyon Ring, escorted by a small formation of Coalition vessels as a gesture of respect and gratitude. Grace watched the station shrink behind them through the rear viewport, thinking of everything that had changed in the span of just a few short days. A species once feared and avoided had become an ally. A war that seemed unwinnable now had a genuine path toward victory, and an old, unfair reputation had finally begun to shift toward something closer to the truth. As the ship prepared to enter the corridor back toward Earth, Nathan's voice crackled through their communication system, relayed through the newly established connection between the two civilizations. "Welcome home, Horizon Crest. I understand congratulations are in order." "We will explain everything once we land," Grace said, allowing herself a tired, genuine smile as the ship's engines hummed steadily beneath her feet. "Let us just say, humanity finally got the chance to prove it was never the danger the galaxy assumed. We were simply the help nobody knew they needed yet." The stars stretched out endlessly before them as the Horizon Crest disappeared into the corridor, carrying with it the beginning of an alliance that would reshape the future of two civilizations, one built not on fear, but on the simple, unshakable choice to answer when someone else needed help. Back on the Halcyon Ring, Vesa remained at the observation deck long after the ship had departed, watching the empty space where it had been only moments earlier. Beside her, Torin stood in quiet reflection, his earlier doubts about the humans replaced entirely by something closer to hope. "Do you think they will come back, if the Ashen Fleet returns?" Torin asked. Vesa smiled softly, thinking of everything she had witnessed over the past several days, of courage born not from arrogance, but from a species that had simply refused, time and time again, to accept defeat as an option. "I do not think we need to wonder," she said. "I think we already know the answer." Somewhere far across the galaxy, the crew of the Horizon Crest continued their journey home, unaware of just how deeply their choice to answer a single, desperate signal had already begun to change the course of history for two entire civilizations, forever bound now by a bond built not on fear, but on the simple courage to show up when it mattered most.